Hi, I'm Hayley from Storybrewers, and today I'm going to be explaining every detail in this fictional 19th century letter. What are they, and what do they reveal? The letter I am looking at is from an epistolary game we created called My Late Father's Correspondence, and it's the first letter in the game, so it won't spoil anything, but this video will give you some interesting insights. If you're interested in the full game, I put the link in the description, but I won't talk too much about it now because I think this letter does a better job of explaining what the game is all about than I can, so let's get into it. This letter has been written on November 28th, 1832, and it is addressed to Agatha Lockley, who's the character you play in the game, at Eadley Hall, Millcote, Hampshire. So I'm going to read the letter first, and then I'll be talking about all the little clues it gives us. My darling Aggie, I hope the days after the funeral weren't too trying. It is one thing to face the endless stream of condolences about your father's death when you have your dearest aunt by your side, but it's quite another thing to be left in that big great house all by yourself. I write with tragic news I am to be delayed in London. With your older brother Nicholas so long away, and thus absconded from all duties and responsibilities, the business of executing your father's estate is far more of a mess than I could have imagined. I have, of course, written to his last address and the one before that, as no doubt you have. I'm not, however, too hopeful he will suddenly appear in London in readiness for the responsibilities of inheritance. Nevertheless, I am duty-bound to do all I can to find him before anything else can be resolved, so I am doing what I must. In the meantime, you shall have to see to the running of the estate and handle the barrages of the many well-wishers. These are both tasks I know you are most capable of, but are tiresome nevertheless. Perhaps most tedious of all, it is imperative that you open and reply to all the various correspondences that will now come flooding in, those for yourself, and most especially those addressed to your father. Your butler, Mr. Alder, will bring the letters to you each morning. Take them, and let them rest on your desk for just a moment. Take a breath, and then when you are ready, read and reply to each. It is crucial that you reply to all correspondence on the day of its arrival, as at this important time, matters are best taken care of swiftly. You hardly need me to tell you this, but be considered in your response, as there are delicate matters afoot. My dear, you know people will say all kinds of things in their letters, of you and of your father both. You'll do well to remember that it is merely their opinion, and take it with a grain of salt. It is all too common people misremember, or their prejudices come to the forefront. Except for me, of course, I am your favourite aunt, and therefore right about everything. I know you and your father did not always see eye to eye. He could be a difficult man in his own way. But we all have our moods, and he loved you through each and every one of them that overtook him. At any rate, some of his acquaintances shall be vital to your place in society now he has gone. Especially as you are 23 and yet unmarried, you may find yourself calling on them for favours in the future. Not that now is a time to think about such things. Heavens, you are in mourning. Look after yourself, my dearest, keep well, and I shall be back as soon as I can, heaven willing, with your brother in tow, but heaven may indeed not will it. Write to me now, even if briefly, and do assure me you are well. Your loving aunt, Gertrude Allington. Alright, so let's back it up, right up all the way here to the cover of this letter. And let's talk about everything we see here, because there's a lot we learn from this. So this game takes place in England in 1832. And this was a time before both postage stamps and envelopes, so how on earth did people send mail? Well, letters at this time were folded in a way called letterlocking, which was used for hundreds of years already at this point, and different people had different ways of folding their letters. But the basic idea is that you fold the letter so that the written portion is on the inside, and the address is showing on the outside, and then you seal it, either with a wax seal if it was an important letter, or with a letter wafer, which is like a round thing that becomes a sticky paste if it was a less important letter. So almost every single letter you see in the game will have been letterlocked. What about postage before stamps? Well, before stamps, post was sent using a system of postmarks that were stamped onto the letter so that you could see where the post had come from and how much it cost. These postage marks varied widely from place to place and even year to year, so you'll see a number of them in the game. So we have two postmarks here. We have a TP Piccadilly mark and a paid mark with an 8 next to it. And these marks are both in red, which means this letter has been completely prepaid by your aunt. And that is actually very unusual. So most letters at this time are actually postpaid, and in general they're paid by the head of the family upon receipt of the mail. So if someone was sending a letter to your father before he passed away, they would have sent it postpaid, and your father will have paid the mail charge to the postman, which was quite substantial, by the way. Mail was expensive. This letter has been prepaid instead, and she's actually had to pay for two separate mail charges. The first is the 2-penny post charge. That's the postmark here. TP stands for 2-penny post. However, 2-penny post only services a certain area of London, So your aunt has paid this extra charge of 8 pennies. That's the cost of sending from London to Millcote, Hampshire. And that's charged by a number of things, principally distance. So from this charge, we know that Millcote is between 60 and 80 miles from London. However, this postage charge also takes into account both the weight and the number of sheets used, and things get expensive very quickly. So the interesting thing is, why has your aunt prepaid this letter if that's not the norm? Well, clearly she is a woman who has a generous income, whether because she is a widow and has kept charge of the family fortune, or because she receives a good amount of pin money, which is sort of an allowance that she is paid by her husband that would have been determined in their marriage contract. She's most likely paid this postage because she doesn't want to burden Ely Hall with extra costs at this difficult time. We also learn one other thing from this postmarks that suggests your aunt has a generous disposable income. So when you send a letter via the 2-penny post like your aunt has here, you need to drop it off at a 2-penny post receiver. And they had these all around London, and they weren't post offices, but rather a person at some other business. Kind of like how nowadays you might have to go pick up a missed parcel from a news agency. So she's dropped this off at the closest 2-penny post office from where she's staying on Piccadilly. And Piccadilly is a very important road in London at this time because it's sort of the border of the Mayfair district. Mayfair is a very wealthy area. It's where the 1% are staying in London in this time, particularly if they're staying only temporarily, which is true of your aunt. And your aunt likely goes there often and has particular rooms that she likes to rent. To give you some idea, we can take a look at Mayfair on Charles Booth's poverty map of London. So Charles Booth made this amazing map of London where he color-coded each district by wealth level. Now this was actually made some 50 years later, but it still gives you a sense of where the wealthy areas of London were. And you can see here Mayfair and Piccadilly are in gold, which he notated as upper middle and upper classes, wealthy area. And if we zoom out, we can see where this sits in the context of the whole of London itself. Alright, so that's the postmarks. Let's go one page over to the letter itself. So the first thing you can notice about this letter is this very conspicuous black border. So what's that about? Your aunt has written on pre-printed mourning stationery. So during the Regency, and even more so a few years later in the Victorian era, if someone close to you died, you'd enter a period of mourning. Now conventions around this shift and changed over time, and mourning was not as static and formal in 1832 as it was in the Victorian era. But generally mourning was a period where those close to a loved one who'd passed away did things a certain way to show their grief. This included the way they dressed, the kind of social occasions they would attend, and as you can see, the kind of stationery they might use. Mourning stationery itself wasn't required by society's conventions, but it was a way of showing people you were in a time of grief. The full mourning period for a parent was usually up to 6 months, and it's likely that as Agatha, you'd be in mourning throughout the entire game. For the first few months, this would be full mourning, which is a period where you'd be likely to dress in all black, including hats and jewelry. Your aunt herself could be in mourning for up to 3 months. It's also likely, as the most important woman connected to the Lockley family, she could not only handle mourning how she liked, but it's also her prerogative to make suggestions as to how you should handle your mourning period, which she does later on in the game. So the first thing we notice from what your aunt actually writes is that your father has, in his will, appointed your aunt as the executor of his estate. So your aunt would be your father's sister, even though her last name has, of course, changed because of marriage. She would have originally been a Lockley as well. And since your father decided to appoint her, not only do we know that he trusted your aunt with such things, but you probably don't have any uncles on your father's side, because if you did, it's more likely they would be named the executor rather than your aunt. However, something like this was a thing that women could and did do as needed. As the executor of the estate, your aunt has the complete ability to run Ely Hall until it is passed onto the beneficiary under the will. In this case, your older brother Nicholas. So theoretically, she would have to authorize every little thing, including selling crops and paying servants. You wouldn't be able to hire a servant, for example, or purchase new equipment for the kitchen without her approval. In reality, the lawyers are likely handling the day-to-day of that for her and are just drawing her attention to the most important matters. Your aunt is determined to find your brother Nicholas, and as the executor, she has an obligation under law to try her utmost to find him, to the point of literally hiring detectives to find him before she can resolve the matter. If she does all this and she can't find him, she can apply for a court order saying he can't be found and his inheritance falls to the next person, at least temporarily. However, this could all take a very, very long time, and until it does, your aunt is stuck administering the estate, as I mentioned before. And while the estate will eventually have to pay any expenses incurred from this, your aunt might be paying out of pocket now for things like staying in London. She might even have to pay some legal costs and administration costs in the hope of being reimbursed later. So not a great situation for her to be stuck in for potentially a year or more while the issue of Nicholas is resolved. And not great for you either, because it is very hard for you to make any changes at Eatley Hall. Now, your aunt mentions that you are alone at Eatley Hall in terms of family. But the great irony of that is, of course, you're still surrounded by people, as the hall would still be fully or substantially staffed at this time. But those people don't have the same relationship with you. They're your employees, essentially. Or not even yours, the estate's actually. So the head of these would be Mr. Alder, your butler. And as well as this, there might be as many as 8 or even more other staff members just indoors for your family, including the housekeeper, 1 or 2 footmen, a number of maids, and of course the cook and the kitchen staff. Some of these staff might have known you a very long time. Okay. In the last part of this letter, your aunt is noting, though she tries to soften it somewhat, your social position is not the greatest at the moment. Your father is passed, so he can't look out for you in the marriage market. Your brother, who should be doing that job, is not here, and you're not independently wealthy either because you're not the one who's going to inherit the estate. So while you're from a good family, there's no one to advocate for you socially when it comes to gentlemen and their families. And that's why your father's friends might be important contacts for you. So that is the walkthrough of the first letter in my late father's correspondence. I hope that gives you some insight into the historical context and also the ways in which the little details can give away so much about the characters who appear in the game. If you find yourself intrigued, you can grab the game and discover so much more.